Thank you. So let's just do a very brief recap on the last lecture. So as you know, we've been trying to sort of understand Dr. Ambedkar's worldview, his thought world, through the series of concepts that he has developed to understand caste. And I have proposed that he developed a veritable new vocabulary. And in that context, in my last lecture, we considered his understanding of Brahmanism. And as we know, he considered Brahmanism as central to sustaining exploitation and oppression as capitalism in the modern world. But he also has given us a very rich historical account of how Brahmanism emerged and what has been its role and function, and that it was articulated by a priestly class, and that the class sustained its power and hegemony through controlling access to philosophical and spiritual learning. And on that account, it also came to control the narrative, as we call it today, not only in terms of how human beings ought to relate to God, but also how human beings ought to relate to each other. And as Dr. Ambedkar so sharply pointed out, created a system where it rendered inequality sacred. It sanctified inequality, making it seem as if God created human beings in this unequal fashion, and that the only manner in which one can exit from the system of inequality is to surrender oneself to God, so to speak. And that idea is sort of given flesh and blood, so to speak, in the Bhagavad Gita. This is on the one hand. On the other hand, you have a series of extremely powerful social restraints, which sometimes are translated into legal restraints. And the Manusmriti is the text that is what Dr. Ambedkar called the gospel of the counter-revolution, along with the Bhagavad Gita. And in the modern period, Dr. Ambedkar was very concerned that just as how devotional Hinduism tried to sort of make the system of graded inequality acceptable, though I don't think it was ever accepted in full, in the modern period, Gandhiism had rendered to work the Varnashrama Dharma system acceptable. And for Dr. Ambedkar, Gandhiism was a particularly problematic philosophical and political ideology because it elevated an individual to the status of a Mahatma, someone who can actually stand above everybody else and guide them, which meant that anyone who accepted the idea of a Mahatma guiding their lives should be willing to give up their own sense of rationality, reasoning, reflection. And that to Dr. Ambedkar was a extremely problematic situation to be in, especially in the era of modernity when democracy was an ideal and each of us had to be fully available to be part of this associated life, as he called it. But I think the more important reason why, or as important reason as to why he considered Gandhiism problematic, apart from all the details, was that it had given a consensus to a strong and emergent Indian nationalism. Before Gandhi arrived on the scene, nationalism was restricted to petitioning the British government. It comprised largely of English-speaking elites who made a case for India to be part of the colonial governance structures. It asked for incremental freedoms. It was only after Gandhi came upon the scene that Indian nationalism acquired a mass base and it became a sort of quasi-religion. And this is something that Periyar also points out in the Tamil context, how the word nationalism, the nation, has come to be imbued with a certain sanctity, with a certain moral fervor because of the manner in which Gandhi had sought to render any participation in the nationalist movement or being part of any struggle to be something that we come to with a matter of conscience, that it's a satyagraha, that it is seen as something where you morally remake yourself and you do it in a spirit which is religious, so to speak. So Periyar had also pointed this out in the 1920s, and Dr. Ambedkar equally so, especially after he came back from his studies at the London School of Economics and got into public life. From the very beginning, Ambedkar was very wary of the manner in which Indian nationalism communicated its content, that it gave to itself a certain high moral and spiritual earnestness that was for him very problematic, because it hid the actual class and caste basis of nationalism. And this is something Dr. Ambedkar points out from very, very early onwards, from his very first submission to the British Commission, Southborough Commission, and also in Muknayak. But especially after he returns from his studies, he points to the limitations of Indian nationalism in the age of Gandhi. And he says that we are not yet a nation. We cannot be a nation because the liberty and equality that we seek from the British, we are not willing to grant to others within the Indian social order. He, of course, had in mind the complete invisibility of the so-called untouchable question, that the Congress, the party of the Indian national movement, had never really thought through what it meant to be part of a system of graded inequality, had never really asked itself, what does it mean to be a society practicing untouchability and at the same time demand equality and liberty from the British? So Ambedkar was very clear that the Congress had never posed this question to itself. And later on, when he came to write Gandhi and what Gandhi and Congress did to the untouchables, he gives us a very sort of strong historical account of how the Congress tried to sort of, even when it did, address the caste system and untouchability. It did so for extremely instrumental and politic reasons. It was only when the Muslim League started to make certain kinds of political demands that the Congress asserted the importance of being a unified Hindu community, and in that context came to address the problem of untouchability. So this is something that he points out from very early on in his writings, going back to the 1920s. And for him, therefore, Gandhi's presence in politics earns for a imperfect, incomplete nationalism a kind of consent that it otherwise would not have had. And this was not only because the Muslim League was opposed to the Congress brand of nationalism, but also because the Congress brand of nationalism did not take on board the system of graded inequality or untouchability in conceptualizing the nation, in coming up with a viable model of national unity, of national identity, which would address the issues of graded inequality and consider seriously the abolition of untouchability. As those of us who's read what Congress and Gandhi knows will remember, that Ambedkar makes it very clear that Gandhi never once made the abolition of untouchability central to being part of the national movement. While spinning of Khadi was made central to being part of the national movement, no congressman or woman was ever asked to commit herself or himself to the abolition of untouchability to be part of the national movement. So this is something that Ambedkar took extremely seriously, and therefore his critique of nationalism starts from its inability to think of the nation in terms of a free, just, equal, and fraternal society which would be committed to the annihilation of caste. It might be for political liberty. It might be for freedom from British rule. But as Ambedkar made very clear, self-government or Swarajya or Swaraj can never be a substitute for good government. And good government necessarily is that which would challenge internal inequalities as much as it would challenge external tyranny, external political tyranny. So this was Dr. Ambedkar's very strong and early critique of Indian nationalism. And so this is something that he kept up all his life. And therefore, his sense of the Indian nation was that it did not yet exist, that it maybe at some day, at some point in history, it may come alive, it may evolve as a nation, but that evolution has to happen in history and can only happen through conscious and critical political effort, which would take on board both the problems posed by political tyranny as well as the problems posed by social tyranny. And in this context, when he sort of uh, developed his critique of the Indian nation as it had emerged in the discourse of the Indian National Congress, indeed in the discourses of nationalism as they existed in his time, he also had to address or bestow attention on the parallel sort of arguments being made by two other political formations. One was, of course, the Muslim League. The other was, at least from the late 1920s, the growing body of the Indian left. And I'll come to both of these in a moment. But I will start with the Muslim League because I think one of the things that Ambedkar points to, both in what Gandhi and Congress did, and in, of course, various other submissions that he makes to the British government, when the British invite Indians to testify about how they see their role in government. And there he points out that the claims made by the Muslim League, which appear to challenge Indian nationalism, or the claims of the Indian National Congress to represent everybody, these also have to be studied because the Muslim League posits itself as a minority party, that it is supporting minority claims. And therefore, for Ambedkar, it becomes very important to understand what does the Muslim League have to offer by way of rethinking Indian nationalism. So from the time of his submission to various British committees, but especially during the Simon Commission hearings, Dr. Ambedkar suggests that one needs to think of what a future Indian constitution, in however minimal a form, would look like, is to think of it from the point of view of the minorities. So unless the minorities are allowed to participate in the constitutional process and receive constitutional guarantees that they would be sufficiently represented, adequately represented in any constitutional scheme, you can never really hope to evolve a fulsome, just and fair constitution for the whole of India. Now, Ambedkar is very aware that such a constitution can never be really fully sketched out until India is free. He's very aware of that. And he makes that very clear in his submission to the first roundtable conference. He's also very clear in his critique of colonialism, that colonialism is based on an extractive political economy, that it has imposed a huge tax burden on India's poor, that it has bled Indian artisanal industries white, that it exists for the greater glory of the British Empire. At the same time, he points out that colonialism has been the context in which India became part of an emerging modern historical moment, and that the coming of various modern developments like the railway or the printing press, or indeed the modern systems of law, have actually helped to accentuate certain contradictions in Indian society. It has enabled the undercaste or the Bahujans and the Dalits or the so-called untouchables to come to a sense of themselves. So while he was very critical of colonial political rule and colonial economic dominance, he distinguished the modern moment which emerged during colonial rule from colonial rule itself. So he wanted to therefore be part of whatever colonial governance structures that existed, because those were essentially for the modern governance structures. So therefore he did not see himself as being unnationalist or non-nationalist in doing so. And again, he made it clear to the Indian National Congress that if he is seeking to make certain claims on behalf of the minorities, if the Muslim League is making certain claims on behalf of the minorities, they are both in different ways doing this because they want to be part of a constitutional system which in the future would be truly national. And that truly national would only come about if it entails and enables the participation of minorities in what Dr. Ambedkar called the associated life, where they would be in a position to reset the terms of association, reimagine what political goals could be like, offer a positive critical position or content to the evolution of common shared national goals. So for Ambedkar, his work with colonial systems of governance was essentially a work towards evolving an Indian nation that was yet to be. So it is from this position that he sort of talks about what guarantees can be there for minorities within any evolving constitutional scheme for India. And it is in this context that he also addresses the Muslim League and the Muslim League's demands. And as we have seen in my earlier lectures, especially the one on democracy, right from the beginning, he was very critical of the way the Muslim League posed the minority question. And the reasons why he was critical was that he felt that the Muslim League represented elite Muslim interests, just as how the Congress represented elite caste and class interests, that the Muslim League was making demands on the basis of what they perceived to be their rightful place in Indian public life. And as far as Ambedkar was concerned, their understanding of their rightful place in Indian political life was based on their previous historical experience in India, which is that they were once a ruling combine and they wanted to retain the prestige that they possessed in the past, in the present, in the colonial present, and all their political claims emerged from that context. This is something you see him arguing in the Simon Commission hearings, and he felt that cannot be the basis for asking for special constitutional guarantees. These can only be asked for on a truly democratic basis and not on the basis of having once been a ruling combine. Now, historians may dispute if the Muslim League actually made its claims on that basis. Certainly, Jinnah showed himself to be very much a Democrat when he was part of the Muslim League and equally part of the Indian national movement. But I think Ambedkar's concerns emerged also from the fact that the Muslim League's minority concerns were constantly played off against the sorts of claims that Ambedkar and various other leaders of the so-called untouchables were making during this point in time. So, for example, when the Muslim League demanded parity with the Congress, or it demanded weightage or separate electorates, or wanted a certain number of seats reserved for itself, it did so on the basis of assessing what the Congress's share was to be and what the Muslim League's share was to be. And here was a problem for Ambedkar, because how was this decided? On the basis of the Muslims demanding their rights on the basis of the percentage in the population. And once they did that, they necessarily had to deal with the percentage of Hindus. And the Muslim League made it very clear that the Hindu percentage, whatever that was in the population, can only be established after deducting the so-called untouchable component from it. Because the untouchables were not Hindus, said the Aga Khan very early on. So for Ambedkar, this was a problem because he felt whether it was the Congress saying that the untouchables, so-called untouchables, were part of the Hindu community, or the Muslim League claiming that they were not part of the Hindu community, neither of them was actually interested in what the untouchables themselves had to say. And neither of them were interested in the cause of the abolition of untouchability or the annihilation of caste. So this was Ambedkar's great unease with the Muslim League's demands. The second unease that he had was the way the Muslim League defined minority rights and asked for guarantees. It had sort of emerged as a sort of, let's say, it had created a template, so to speak, based on which every other kind of minority demand was to be assessed. So for the Congress, the solution of the communal problem, as it was called, which was basically the problems posed by Muslims being in a minority and the demands that they made, became a central solution if the Indian national movement was to remain unified. So the solving of the Hindu-Muslim problem alone was deemed as important to the creation of a viable national movement in India. And for Ambedkar, this was hugely problematic because he felt that the communal problem was perhaps one aspect that had to be addressed in a solution to the Indian national problem, but the other aspect was the problems posed by caste and by the problems posed by untouchability. So the inequalities of the social order, the inequalities that had emerged on account of the Dalits being kept as a part apart, if these were not equally addressed, if the claims of Dalits as an oppressed minority were not taken as seriously, then the Indian national problem, as it was understood, could never be adequately solved. And during the second roundtable conference, as we saw, there was some attempt on the part of the Muslims and the Dalits and the Indian Christians and the Anglo-Indians and many others to come up with a sort of united front kind of position against Gandhi's claim that the Indian National Congress alone represented everybody else. But in the event, what happened was that while Gandhi was willing to grant the statutory demands of the Muslim League, he wasn't willing to do so when it came to the untouchables, as we saw. And then we know that this led to the Pune Pact and so on. So again, Ambedkar sort of felt completely vindicated in his stand that while for opportune or contingent reasons, the Muslim League would stand by with the others, once their demands were granted, they were not going to interest themselves in the larger question of social inequality in the Indian context, and they would rest on their own victories, however these were, and that their main quarrel would be with the Indian National Congress. And their main concern was not going to be the problem of democracy as it has to be understood in the context of the Indian social order. So this is something that we need to keep in mind when we think of how Ambedkar sought to understand what an ideal nation could be or how we could become a nation. Now, of course, the point is still 1947, 48, why even till during the Constituent Assembly debates, Ambedkar was very, very, very clear that we were not yet a nation. We might have become free, we might have worked very hard to give ourselves a constitution, but we had not evolved into a nation. And that could only be when, as we saw in the last lecture, we possessed both social and economic democracy along with political democracy. So for him, the nation can only exist if it was a viable, complex republic where the so-called minorities, the oppressed classes and castes, and various other minorities, including the Adivasis and the so-called criminal tribes, were equally part of this associated political life, embodied in parliamentary democracy on the one hand, and in a very sound civic order on the other. Only when all these various constituents could be part of both civic and political life would an ideal republican future for India be imagined or actualized. So he didn't think we were quite a nation even in 1947. But at the same time, he felt that we could be a nation. And what was the reason for that? Now, this point, we may want to sort of step back and look at Ambedkar's conceptual understanding of nationality, of nationhood, and of what a nation is. And in Pakistan or the partition of India, he takes us through these definitions. And we may connect these definitions to other definitions elsewhere. So let's start with something very simple. Why did Ambedkar even think that being a nation was a good thing? And I pose this question because there were other models of being a fraternal, just Republican society at this point in time. And the most attractive model which won adherents across the world was, of course, the communist model, which spoke of not the democracies that had emerged in Western Europe and in other parts of the world as ideal political forms, and which argued instead for a proletarian social order, for what it called a proletarian dictatorship, and for a system of world revolution and of revolutionary governments across the world that would be united. Now, that the communist parties across the world felt this to be a possibility is something we understand when we follow the debates within the Communist International or the Comintern, where it did seem possible that various political formations of a decidedly communist nature could actually be part of an international forum, and from within that forum imagine and actualize new forms of political governance for themselves. Now, in the event, of course, history decided that this would be done very differently given the developments in the Soviet Union, including the Civil War, the unexpected early death of Lenin, the emergence of a leadership in the Soviet Union that identified the world revolution with the survival of the Soviet state, and the sorts of tensions within the Bolshevik movement and all of that. I'm not going to go to any of those details, but basically that was the other model that existed. But Ambedkar had issues with the Soviet model, which he spoke of in later times. He also wasn't sure of the sort of communist movement that had emerged in India could really sort of be seen as offering an alternative, because the communists were equally part of the national movement. So he did not consider that model as an option. So the nation as a political form, he took seriously, and for these reasons. One is that, as he argues in Pakistan or the partition of India, in the age of democracy, which is the age of the people, where the people declare themselves sovereign, the form of sovereignty that emerged as viable at the moment when the people declared themselves sovereign was the nation. And here Ambedkar draws on the history of French nationalism, because as we all know, he was a great admirer of the French Revolution, and the French initiate the making of the Republic. The French uphold the claims of the Republic against the monarchy, but as the French Revolution receives a setback because of the war that the Republicans have to wage against monarchical forces and the forces from the rest of Europe, the French find themselves upholding the Republic through military means. And then later on, when military victory is secured and Napoleon becomes the consul, the Republic of France also becomes a French nationalist republic. So that's the history Ambedkar is drawing from. And as we've seen equally from the American history, where the American War of Independence is both a war waged against a colonial power, as well as a war for the making of a republic. So America also emerges as a nation and as a republic. Therefore, historically, the ways in which the sovereignty of the people become part of political structures is kind of predetermined. The examples of France and the United States create precedents wherein when you demand political sovereignty as a democratic group of people, the form that is available to you is the form of the nation historically. So that is one reason why Ambedkar sees the nation as a possibility. But that nation has to be forged. It cannot just emerge. And what will make the nation? That's the next question that Ambedkar tries to answer in a conceptual sense. And one is, of course, to acknowledge and build on the right of self-determination, that each nation will reserve the right to determine its own future. And this is also something that Ambedkar sees as viable following the history of the First World War. Following the First World War, when empires are broken up and nations emerge. But he sees very clearly that self-determination cannot only be of just peoples who share a common culture or language or territory. It equally has to be the self-determination of the constituents of a nation to be, which is what I've been discussing all this while, that the Dalits and other minorities should equally be given the right of self-determination. And unless that is done, a nation cannot be forged. But nevertheless, he concedes the right of self-determination as important, as a valuable political virtue. And it is in that context also that he sees the nation as a viable political entity. But let's not forget that every time he makes his argument, he also envisages the nation as a democratic republican form, which has to evolve in line with the demands of particular societies. So he doesn't prescribe a sort of a republican model that's valid for all places and all times. So this is also important for us to keep in mind. Now, the other definition that Ambedkar offers of the nation, and this is important for us to understand, emerges from his sense of what makes for a cogent, coherent society. And as we have seen, for Ambedkar, an ideal form of existence is what he considered a conjoined form of existence, what makes for associated life, what makes for fraternity, the free and frank exchange of views and opinions, where being part of this sort of a political and social context, human beings can interact with each other on a mutual basis where they can both learn and unlearn. They can unlearn prejudices that they have held. They can relearn the virtues of fraternity, where there's a give and take, where there's a possibility of argument, where there's a sort of organic connect between various constituents. And I use the word organic in a very special sense because the word organic also has been used in a fascist sense, both by Mussolini and Hitler when they talk about the organic inner life of nations. But Ambedkar uses the word organic as a sort of alternative to the kind of logic that you have in caste society, which is a kind of geometric logic, a triangular logic, which is the logic of graded inequality and where Dalits are apart. So in opposition to that, he's thinking of a social order where we are connected in a very real, mindful, respectful sense, where we recognize each other's right to be equal and free and so on. So for him, that connectedness is also what would make a nation ultimately. And you will see that he draws on various terms in Pakistan, in the book on Pakistan, where he talks about unified moral purpose, unified social purpose, consciousness of kind, where you will yourself to be a nation, where there is something that binds you. And in many cases, it is a shared religious life, which gives you a shared ethical life, which makes you feel that you're a nation. So these are all arguments that he would deploy in Pakistan or the partition of India when he seeks to understand how the Muslims feel themselves to be a nation or imagine themselves to be a nation. And why the Hindus, therefore, cannot yet fully be a nation. They have to realize their nationality. So you'll see that his sense of the nation is very much the same as his sense of a good, just, fraternal, equal, democratic society. He doesn't separate the one from the other. And as he often argues, the political form that any society can hope to have has to be adequate to the social inequalities and other inequalities it has to counter. So there can be no one prescription for a nation, and each nation has to have its own distinctive historical form. Now, all of this comes together in his understanding of what an ideal nation could be. Therefore, as far as Indian society was concerned, he felt that as a nation, we are not yet there, but we could evolve into this nation if we take on board all these ways in which we can be a good, just, fraternal, democratic society. Now, these are argued out in the book that has since become a very contested text, which is Pakistan or the Partition of India. And this text was written, as we know, initially in 1940 after the Lahore Declaration, where the Muslim League announces that it would not settle for any constitutional system which does not recognize the independence and sovereignty of states where there is a large Muslim majority. Now, the Lahore Declaration itself does not use the word Pakistan, and those of us that know this declaration will attest. And Jinnah himself makes it clear at that time Pakistan was not a clear ideal that had settled into the minds of those who supported the Muslim League's politics. And in fact, the Muslim League itself was not fully a representative Muslim body at that point in time, and we're talking of 1940. There were other Muslim political formations in Bengal and in Punjab, the Unionist Party, which included a large number of Muslims, and the parties in Bengal, and various other Muslim formations, which also had Muslim adherents. So in 1940, nothing was yet settled. But it's at that point in time, Ambedkar writes his book, and he, as he makes it very clear, this book is meant to illuminate the future of the Indian national movement, whether India shall exist as one nation or two nations, and so on. And this book is a very interesting as well as deeply problematic text. I say problematic not because Ambedkar is not clear in what he is doing, but that it can lend itself to various kinds of readings, and that Ambedkar's arguments in this book about nationalism are not quite always distinguishable from arguments made by Hindu or Muslim nationalists. So this is something that we have to keep in mind. And what is Ambedkar's purpose in writing this book? He tells you that the Independent Labour Party wanted him to come out with a position paper on how do we understand the demand for um, uh, 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 Muslim provinces being recognized as independent and sovereign, and therefore he wrote this book. Now, what was the interest of the Independent Labour Party or indeed of Ambedkar in this matter? And Ambedkar makes it clear in Pakistan or the partition of India that the demand of the Muslim League at that time was for the provinces, the Muslim majority provinces and the Hindu majority provinces, to have maximalist power. And the idea was for the center, whatever form the central government or the federal government was to assume, to be a relatively weak center, maximalist provincial autonomy and a minimal center. And for Ambedkar, as we knew, any reductions in the power of the center meant a loss of guarantees or protections for the untouchables, because he understood provincial autonomy or power granted to provincial, regional, or today what we would call state governments as essentially power resting in the hands of dominant caste communities. So that's one reason why he felt that the demand for Pakistan has to be critically understood. And rather than have a weak center with a number of regions that had maximum power, why not have two nations? So that we settle the question of the Muslims wanting to be autonomous once and for all, and then get on with the business of rethinking the Indian social system in ways that would answer to the claims of a fraternal, just social order. So in wanting to settle the Muslim question, Ambedkar speaks not as himself, as he makes it very clear, but in terms of what the Hindus themselves understand by Muslim nationalism. Whether the Hindus concede it or not, what are their concerns about the Muslims demanding a nation? And then he goes on to address these concerns. These are many. One is that can the Muslims be a nation at all? And Ambedkar says that feel they are a nation, they have willed themselves into being a nation, that they, as a religious community, are cemented by bonds which are greater than any other sort of bond. And even if they are to be part of a composite nation, they would still owe primary allegiance to those religious bonds. So it's best to sort of imagine and allow for the possibility of Muslim nationality. The other thing is that given the history of Hindu-Muslim existence over the last decades, which has been one of tension, confrontation, with the Muslim League making maximal demands out of proportion to its presence in the population, completely oblivious to the demands of either other minorities. Ambedkar characterizes the Muslim League's demands as a form of bullying. He feels it's best to let the Muslim League have its way and become a nation. Otherwise, you would be stuck with a minority that is constantly going to make maximalist demands on a composite Indian nation state. Also, he argues that Hindus themselves are not democratic. They have never conceded Muslim demands to be just. They have always attempted to speak for Muslims in the name of the Indian National Congress. So that's another reason as to why the Muslim demand must be allowed. Now, in all these arguments, while Ambedkar is answering to Hindu fears, Hindu anxieties, and he himself says, I want to convince the Hindus, he draws on extremely problematic historical and cultural arguments, which were the staple of Orientalist imperial histories. So the historians he quotes are all imperial historians who have always argued that the Muslim presence in Indian history symbolized the Dark Ages and that the British presence ended those Dark Ages. So he draws on those texts in a very sort of straightforward manner, which leaves us with more questions than answers. But on the other hand, he concedes that Muslims have become part of Indian culture, but he says that's because many of the converts are from Dalit Bahujan communities and they remain tied to caste cultures in some ways. Therefore, you get the idea of a shared culture, but is it really a shared culture? So this is also an argument he raises. So basically, while he's arguing for a nation as something that has to evolve and emerge and be cemented by a feeling of oneness, consciousness of kind, which he says that the Muslims have and that the Hindus don't yet have, he also is making certain very problematic statements about why the Muslims are a nation. And so these are things that we have to keep in mind when he reads this, when we read this text. But then he comes back to this text in 1945 and adds an appendix where he sort of steps back and he says that the arguments in 1940, the arguments that I made about Muslim nationality are not written in stone. I'm willing to revisit them. I now want to point out that there is enough for us to exist together as a composite nation. Much depends on which aspect of our national existence we wish to stress. And if we agree that we can be a composite nation and take on board the legitimate claims of a range and a spectrum of minorities, then we might emerge and become a different kind of nation. But since we are not willing to countenance the claims of these various minorities, and the fact that the Muslims feel themselves to be a nation, perhaps it's better to let them secede, become a nation, experience what that means, and take a call after 10 years. So this is a position that he ends with in that book. Now that book is important because it lends itself to this reading that Ambedkar felt that the Muslims can never be a part of India. No, that's completely untrue. Ambedkar felt that the Muslim League had created a kind of national feeling which Muslims were willing to subscribe to, but there was equally a shared life, however caught within the caste system it was, and much depends on what you want to emphasize. That's his final position. He did not think that the Muslims could never be a part of what emerged as the Indian nation. But at this point in time, you also have to remember that the kind of nation he wanted India to be was very different from the kind of nation that the Indian National Congress had in mind. And the other thing was also, Ambedkar was very aware of the emergence of the Hindu right wing. And in 1940, when he wrote his book on Pakistan, the Hindu Mahasabha was already a very powerful force. Savarkar was drawing to himself any number of adherents, and his vision for Akhand Bharat, as he calls it, also had adherents within the Indian national movement. In fact, the right wing within the Indian national movement, linked to the Indian bourgeois and the Indian business classes, was emerging as a very vital and determinate force in the national movement. And the left wing, even if it was vociferous, you had Jayaprakash Narayan in the Congress Socialist Party, you had Bose, you had Nehru, you had the communists who were supporting the CSP, but together they could not really bend the Congress to move leftward. Whereas Gandhi, with Gandhi's support extended to the Congress right wing of Vallabhbhai Patel, of Madan Mohan Malaviya and various others, could actually make a case for the Hindus in the nationalist movement. And many of their points of view were actually part of Congress policy making. And by the 1940s, the RSS had emerged with a very strong cadre, and Ambedkar was aware of that as well. So I think in order to sort of not further fuel the fans of this sort of nationalism, though Ambedkar also said that the Congress right wing, indeed the Congress itself, in essence, sometimes seems very Hindu nationalist, or it's constitutively Hindu nationalist. This is something that Ambedkar keeps arguing in different points in time. But he felt that the draw of the Hindu nationalist groups was also getting to be very powerful, and one way to sort of neutralize that was to endorse the Pakistan demand. The reasons he uses to endorse the demand are problematic, but he sees it as a democratic demand. He sees it as something that the Muslims want, so there is something to be said there. And let's not forget, the communists at that time also endorsed the Pakistan demand. So I think it is not simply that the endorsing of the Pakistan demand is a problem, but the reasons he adduces do lend themselves to being a set of problems that we are left to deal with until this day because of the way the Hindu right wing in this country makes uses of them. But the Hindu right wing, of course, conveniently forgets Ambedkar's critique of Hindu nationalism, of the Indian national movement, of Gandhiism, of the right wing, of the Brahmin Banya combine, all those arguments he makes in what Gandhi and Congress have done, and subsequently at several um, points in his historical writings during the Constituent Assembly debates and so on. So I think to end with this lecture on Brahmanism and nationalism, Ambedkar's critique of Indian nationalism stems from the fact that it does not pay attention to graded inequality and to Dalits being a part of that it is sustained by Gandhism, which has given a new lease of life to Varnashrama Dharma and therefore to Brahmanism, that the whole rhetoric of nationalism has a certain religious moral fervor attached to it, which works against the sort of Republican nationalism he himself endorses, and that with the emergence of the Muslim League and the demand for Muslim nation, it is of nationhood, it is possible that a fillip would be given to maximalist Hindu nationalist demands. And these are all things that go into Ambedkar's understanding of nationalism as it existed, but it does not take away, however he argues in Pakistan on the partition of India, none of these arguments take away from his understanding that we are not yet a nation, and we can only be a nation when we become a fulsome democratic republic with a strong commitment to ending social and economic inequality. So I will leave you with those thoughts and ideas. Time for questions.